Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. The roots of conflict. The Ottoman pressure cooker. To really wrap our heads around the modern complexities of the Middle East, especially the historical roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we actually have to look way past today's headlines. We need to rewind the clock. Literally back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, long before the outbreak of the First World War, to examine the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire. And to truly grasp the environment that cultivated these tensions over centuries, I want you to imagine a really powerful metaphor, a giant geopolitical pressure cooker.
So how exactly do you govern a pressure cooker? To understand why this region became so fiercely complicated to rule by the dawn of the 20th century, we have to ask ourselves, how do you manage a political pot filled with such complex, diverse ingredients? Just imagine this massive, ironclad pot. It's sealed super tight by a central authority, in this case the Ottoman Sultan ruling all the way from Istanbul. Inside this pot, you've got countless distinct elements, all simmering together. Now for centuries, the sheer weight of that imperial lid keeps everything contained, right? It maintains order. But as time marches on, the heat beneath the pot begins to rise. Those ingredients start pushing against each other, and inevitably, they push against the lid itself.
By 1905, the sheer size of that Ottoman pot was absolutely colossal. From their capital in Istanbul, Ottoman rulers held dominion over a sweeping expanse of territory stretching across parts of Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. This was one of the most formidable empires in world history. Just a massive, rigid structure trying to maintain absolute control over an incredibly wide swath of the globe. But here's the catch. Maintaining ironclad control over millions of square miles inevitably meant ruling over an immense, deeply entrenched variety of people.
The empire was defined as multi-ethnic. It contained many different ethnic or cultural groups. This wasn't a monolith. The Middle East wasn't some single, united region where everyone shared the exact same historical background or identity. It was a complex mosaic. We're talking about an incredibly broad geographical zone governed by an imperial authority that had to somehow, some way, figure out how to administer laws, collect taxes, and run military conscription over an extreme spectrum of human diversity. Simmering inside this imperial pressure cooker were Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and Armenians living alongside highly significant local populations of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Now, drawing on the immense resources, trade networks, and cultural strengths of so many diverse peoples is exactly what made the empire incredibly wealthy and enduring in the first place. But, and this is a huge but, that exact same diversity made it inherently fragile. It made it incredibly difficult to hold together when external pressures really started to mount.
Let's pause and put ourselves in the shoes of the imperial administration in Istanbul for a second. Why might empires find it so difficult to rule over many different peoples? When your empire encompasses dozens of distinct populations spread across 3 continents, what systemic vulnerabilities do you inevitably face? If the subjects within your borders don't share a cohesive national identity, how on earth do you engineer lasting stability? How do you mandate a unified legal code that doesn't actively alienate vast segments of your population? The friction of governing this level of diversity was an overwhelming structural challenge.
Governing immense diversity naturally forces competing interests into very close quarters. First off, widespread linguistic differences create immediate, massive logistical barriers to unified administration and just basic communication. Second, diverging religious and social customs dictate entirely different ways of approaching law, education, and daily life. Third, these distinct groups inherently develop competing political aims. What economically benefits a merchant class in one province might literally devastate agricultural communities in another. And ultimately, as these fault lines deepen over generations, they inevitably breed fervent demands for regional independence and self-rule.
So the crucial breaking point is the inevitable historical friction that erupts when the traditional framework of an empire, being ruled by one powerful state, directly collides with nationalism, the belief that groups with a shared identity should have their own nation. An empire demands absolute submission to a central, overarching state, regardless of local culture or ethnic makeup. But as the world moves steadily toward the 20th century, this fiercely potent ideological wave began sweeping across the globe, directly threatening the very existence of these traditional multi-ethnic power structures. And that wave was nationalism, the belief that a group of people with a shared identity should have their own nation or government. As this ideology took hold in the 19th and 20th centuries, it acted like a blazing fire under our Ottoman pressure cooker. Different populations were no longer just culturally distinct, they were actively politically motivated. The fundamental belief that communities with a shared identity possessed an inherent right to draw their own borders and govern themselves directly challenged the Sultan's authority.
This tectonic shift in ideology is a vital root of the geopolitical earthquakes that would soon follow.
This mounting friction was perhaps most potent in the region of Palestine. Fully integrated into the Ottoman imperial system before the outbreak of the First World War, Palestine was a vital piece of this massive multi-ethnic puzzle. But, it wasn't just another administrative zone. Palestine held a deeply unique historical characteristic that profoundly amplified the broader tensions of rising nationalism and imperial decline.
Because right in the heart of Palestine sits Jerusalem, a city holding deeply profound, intimately overlapping historical and spiritual importance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. We aren't simply talking about lines drawn on a map for tax collection or trade routes here. We are talking about physical land tied intrinsically to core faith, ancient history, and the deeply held identities of multiple distinct communities at the exact same time.
Now, it is highly important to note that religious significance does not automatically trigger conflict. People of varying faiths shared this geography peacefully for centuries. However, in the context of a declining empire, it acts as a powerful, undeniable amplifier. The immense spiritual weight attached to this specific land made control of the area intensely important. When you mix the rising, uncompromising tide of nationalism with territory that multiple groups consider vital to their very existence, the stakes for governance become astronomically high.
Bringing these historical threads together, the roots of conflict start to become really clear. We can see the long-term architecture taking shape well before the major wars of the 20th century erupted. We have an expansive territory under strict Ottoman control. We have a highly complex, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious demographic reality. We introduce the disruptive, accelerating force of nationalism demanding localized self-rule. And we center all of this compounding pressure squarely on Palestine and Jerusalem, a geographic focal point of ultimate religious importance. It is the absolute perfect recipe for a geopolitical pressure cooker.
This dynamic is captured perfectly in this insight. When land has religious, political, and strategic importance, disagreements over control can become more intense. It wasn't just about localized farming rights or access to Mediterranean trade ports. It was about securing holy sites. It was about achieving national survival in a modernizing world, and it was about strategically positioning to fill the massive power vacuum of a slowly fracturing empire. Every single localized disagreement gets exponentially magnified when the land itself is viewed as completely irreplaceable.
Which leaves us with a crucial final thought to ponder today. When the pressure cooker of an empire finally loses its lid, who inherits the complex, intertwined claims left behind? The Ottoman Empire, that heavy iron lid keeping everything sealed, would ultimately collapse following the devastation of the First World War. When those rigid borders of a multi-ethnic empire finally gave way, how did the incredibly diverse groups left behind navigate their fiercely conflicting historical, political, and religious claims to the exact same piece of earth? The roots of the conflict were planted centuries ago. It was really only a matter of time before the harvest.